Okay, so now comes the extremely exciting part, okay? We are actually going to learn how to implement Ajax and using JavaScript to send asynchronous requests to our server. So what will happen is in the background, our browser will send out a request to our browser, and it will send all of this data that we are going to be filling out here, and the server will validate this data, and if it's valid, it will just simply change the contents of this modal here and say you have successfully registered without reloading the page. So this will give a really nice and very neat and clean user experience for our users. And if the server validates the information and finds something wrong in this information, it will go ahead and show this alert that we created and have hidden, okay? So this is going to be really nice, and you're going to learn the basics of creating very nice and engaging experiences on the web and very clean experiences. So let's get right to it. First thing we'll need to do is we're going to need to write a bit of JavaScript, okay? Now we're going to do this in a new file. So we're going to go again in Commons, create a new HTML file, and say register modal.js.html, okay? Because this is it's an HTML file, but in fact we're going to be writing a bunch of JavaScript code in here. So the first thing we need to do is we need to declare the script, okay? Because we're going to be writing JavaScript, so we separate the HTML from the JavaScript by opening the script tag and writing our JavaScript inside of the script tag. Now, by the way, again, we need to include this into our form. So let's copy this, and we need to include it after we loaded all of the libraries. So we have to include it right here at the bottom, and this is register modal.js.html. Okay. Now let's see if this is working. We'll just reload our source code and see if we have empty script tags here. So we have them here, so this is all nice and working. Okay, good. So let's go back to our register modal.js file and start writing our JavaScript. Now, previously we have integrated a framework which is called jQuery. If you remember here, we have loaded it up here. This is jQuery. Now, jQuery gives us access to very nice and clean ways of dealing with JavaScript, okay? So whenever we want to use jQuery, we have to call the $sign. So whenever you see a $sign, you can always suspect that we're using jQuery somewhere. Okay, so what do we have to do now? Okay, so if I go back to my web application and hit the register, we have to detect whenever someone clicks here, we have to send this asynchronous request to our server. Okay, so how do we do this in jQuery? Well, we need to bind a click event listener to this button, and whenever someone clicks it, we need to perform some kind of function, okay? So in this case, our function is going to be launch a asynchronous post request to our server, okay? Okay, great. So how do we do this? Well, let's go back to our JavaScript, and we need to select the button, okay? So in jQuery, we have fancy selectors, which we can select using their ID. So let's go back to our modal, and in fact we haven't actually declared an ID for this register button, so let's go ahead and do this now, and we'll call this register button, register dash button. Okay, so let's just copy and go back here and say we want to call this register button. Now the way jQuery calls items by their ID is we have to add a $sign before the actual ID, okay? So now we're calling this. And what we can do now is use the click method. So this is, we're listening to when it's being clicked, and in here we can define a function, okay? So the way we do this in JavaScript is we simply, inside of the click event, we type in function, open and close brackets, because we're not going to be passing anything into the function, and we declare the function using these curly braces. Now in JavaScript, indentation doesn't matter. In Python, indentation is very important because if we indent something incorrectly, it won't work. In JavaScript, it doesn't matter how we indent things, it will still work. However, it's always nice to indent things properly just so our code is nice and readable, okay? Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we actually have to retrieve the value of each of these inputs. So again, how do we do this? Well, again, we have to call each of these inputs and check what their value is. So we do this by, let's actually create new variables and store these values in the variables. So let's say var name. So this is our variable name. Again, using jQuery, we're going to access the item with the ID name, because if you recall, we called our name field here with the name tag. And actually before name comes email. So I'm going to go back and actually above name, I'm going to say var email is equal to the same dollar, because we're using jQuery to access the element with ID user underscore email. Okay. And also in JavaScript, it's always better to add this semicolon at the end of each line, because this way it says the interpreter that this is a end of your line of code. Okay. And the last thing is var password. So again, the same thing here. # password. Okay, good. So now what we can do to actually check that we are actually registering this click properly and that we're accessing all of these values correctly, as in Python, similarly, we can print these items to our console. So let's go ahead and say console.log and say email, and the same thing for name and password. Okay, good. Let's see if this is working. And to access our console in Chrome, in Google Chrome, this will be very similar to other web browsers, but we have to right click and hit something in the sorts of inspect element or maybe developer tools or something like that. And here we can go to our console. Okay, so let's refresh this page, register, and hit email is going to be hello, name is going to be test, and password is going to be something else. Okay, so we see that we are registering the click correctly, and we are actually printing out the entire input. Okay, so to access their values, we have to actually call the val method on each one of these. So let's just call the val method and rerun this experiment. And we see that we are getting the values correctly in our console. So great, this is working.